Iran thought its troubles at Kharg Island were behind it. American airstrikes in early March 2025 had destroyed every military installation on the small Persian Gulf island. Radar systems, air defense batteries, command posts, all of it gone. But the oil terminals and pipelines, the arteries through which Iran pumps its economic lifeblood to the outside world, were left standing. For a regime already buckled by decades of sanctions and internal mismanagement, that was a crucial reprieve. The oil could still flow. The money could still come in. The government could keep its head above water for another day. But that window may be closing. The United States is now sending a second major marine force toward Kharg Island, adding to one already en route, and the combined weight of what is being assembled points towards something far larger than a simple show of force. Whether the U.S. ultimately chooses to blockade the island, seize it outright, or destroy what it deliberately spared the first time around, Iran's regime faces a threat that its military, battered and degraded as it now is, may not be able to stop. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand exactly what is heading Iran's way and what the United States appears to be preparing to do with it. According to reporting by the War Zone, the U.S. is deploying the USS Boxer Amphibious Ready Group from its home port on the West Coast to the Middle East. The group is built around the USS Boxer, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship capable of carrying hundreds of Marines and launching aircraft from its deck. Accompanying it are two other amphibious warships, the USS Portland, a San Antonio-class transport dock, and the USS Comstock, a Whidbey Island-class dock landing ship. Together, these three vessels form a self-contained platform for projecting ground forces onto a hostile shore, capable of getting troops from open water onto a contested beach with minimal outside support. Aboard these ships is the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, a force of roughly 2,500 Marines trained specifically for amphibious operations, the kind that involve landing on beaches, securing ports, and holding territory under fire. They bring with them not just rifles and boots, but artillery, armored vehicles, attack helicopters, and F-35B fighter jets capable of taking off and landing vertically, giving them flexibility that conventional carrier-based aircraft lack. The F-35B can operate from the deck of the USS Boxer itself without the need for a dedicated aircraft carrier. This is not a peacekeeping contingent. It is a force designed and equipped to fight its way onto land and hold what it takes. What makes this deployment especially significant is that the 11th MEU is not the first to be sent toward Iran. In mid-March, news emerged that the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit had been redeployed from its permanent base in Okinawa, Japan, and was heading to the Middle East with its own complement of amphibious assault ships and approximately 2,000 Marines. Those forces are expected to arrive in the Persian Gulf region by the end of March 2025. The 11th MEU is expected to follow in the weeks after, meaning that at some point in April, the United States could have more than 4,500 Marines, along with the ships, aircraft, and equipment to support them, positioned within striking range of Kharg Island. That kind of force does not get assembled and sent halfway around the world without a purpose. Military analysts and defense officials have been watching the buildup closely, and the consensus is that the U.S. is actively preparing for one of three courses of action. Each of those courses of action would have profound consequences for Iran, for global energy markets, and for the wider conflict unfolding across the Persian Gulf region. But before examining what those options are, it is worth pausing to understand why Kharg Island has become the focal point of this confrontation in the first place. It is a small, flat island, barely 5 miles from one end to the other, sitting about 25 kilometers off Iran's southwestern coast. There are no mountains to defend, no jungles to retreat into, no natural barriers that would make a determined assault particularly difficult. Its military infrastructure has already been largely destroyed by U.S. airstrikes. On the surface, Kharg Island does not look like much. But Kharg Island is not valuable because of what it is. It is valuable because of what passes through it. Iran holds roughly 10% of the world's proven oil reserves, making it one of the most oil-rich nations on the planet. But having oil underground is only useful if you can extract it, process it, load it onto tankers, and sell it to someone willing to pay for it. That is precisely what happens at Kharg Island. The island is home to the terminals and pipelines that handle between 85% and 95% of all of Iran's crude oil exports, a staggering concentration of economic infrastructure on an extraordinarily small piece of territory. Every barrel of Iranian crude that reaches a foreign buyer almost certainly passed through Kharg Island first. The financial implications are enormous. According to Iranian state media, Iran's oil revenues topped $46 billion in 2024. If up to 95% of those exports flow through Kharg Island, then losing control of the island, whether through a naval blockade, a ground occupation, or a targeted bombing campaign, would effectively strip away more than $43 billion from Iran's annual income almost overnight. For a government already struggling to pay its bills, fund its military, and maintain even a basic social contract with its population, that would not merely be a serious economic setback. It could be the blow that finally breaks the regime's ability to function. The United States understands this arithmetic very well, and it has been making preparations in the region that go considerably beyond simply deploying Marines. In the weeks leading up to the current buildup, the U.S. has positioned two other categories of assets near Kharg Island that tell their own story about what may be coming. The first is the MQ-4C Triton, a large, high-altitude unmanned aircraft operated by the U.S. Navy. Unlike strike drones most people are familiar with, the Triton's purpose is pure reconnaissance. It can stay aloft for well over 24 hours at a time, sweeping vast stretches of ocean and coastline with its sensors, building a continuously updated picture of what is happening below. On March 20th, one of these aircraft was observed making extended, deliberate orbits directly over Kharg Island's main oil terminal, not passing through en route to somewhere else, but circling, watching, cataloging. Whatever Iranian forces remain on that island are being monitored with a level of precision that leaves very little room for surprise. The second category of asset is more overtly aggressive. The U.S. has deployed both A-10 Thunderbolt II ground attack aircraft and AH-64 Apache attack helicopters to the Strait of Hormuz region. These are not platforms associated with naval patrols or missile defense. They are close air support weapons, built to operate at low altitude over contested ground, destroying hardened positions, coastal installations, and anything else that stands between advancing ground troops and their objective. Both aircraft featured heavily in the early stages of the U.S. campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they played a very specific role: suppressing enemy defenses ahead of Marine landings. The parallels to the current situation are difficult to ignore. Taken together, the picture that emerges is of a military apparatus methodically preparing the ground for action. Reconnaissance drones mapping Kharg Island's defenses around the clock. Attack aircraft staged nearby and ready to suppress coastal missile batteries. Two Marine expeditionary units converging from opposite ends of the Pacific, And, according to CBS News, Pentagon planners who have already completed detailed contingency plans for deploying U.S. ground forces into Iran. The pieces are in place. The decisions about whether and how to use them are being made in Washington right now. The first option the U.S. is believed to be seriously weighing is a naval blockade. Rather than putting troops on Kharg Island, the U.S. could use its incoming amphibious warships to establish a cordon around the island, intercepting and turning back any oil tankers that attempt to reach its terminals. This approach carries a certain strategic symmetry. Iran has spent months disrupting global shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, attacking merchant vessels with drones and fast boats, driving up insurance costs, and forcing tanker captains to think twice before entering the waterway. A U.S. blockade of Kharg Island would be a direct response. If Iran can strangle the strait, the U.S. can strangle Iran's oil exports. The blockade option also avoids the most politically charged element of the other scenarios: American boots on Iranian soil. A naval cordon operates in international waters and could be eased or lifted relatively quickly if negotiations produced results. The U.S. has sufficient assets in the region to make such a blockade credible, with the two incoming amphibious ready groups providing roughly half a dozen warships, backed by the attack aircraft already positioned in the strait. The risks, however, are considerable. A blockade requires ships to hold relatively fixed positions for extended periods, and fixed positions are precisely what Iranian coastal missile batteries are designed to exploit. Iran's missile capabilities have been degraded by U.S. strikes, but they have not been eliminated. Warships sitting predictably off Kharg Island would present Iran with targeting opportunities it could not easily pass up. The U.S. would need to conduct aggressive and sustained suppression of Iranian coastal launch sites for as long as the blockade remained in effect, a major and ongoing military commitment in its own right. The second option, and the one for which the military buildup appears most explicitly configured, is a direct amphibious assault to seize and occupy Kharg Island. This scenario has vocal supporters in Washington. Senator Lindsey Graham, speaking on Fox News Sunday, called on President Trump to take the island by force, arguing that denying Iran its oil revenues would cause the regime to wither and collapse from within. Graham invoked the Battle of Iwo Jima, one of the most famous Marine Corps amphibious assaults in history, as both an inspiration and a precedent. The military calculus for taking the island is, on paper, favorable. General Joseph Votel, the former commander of U.S. Central Command, has estimated that between 800 and 1,000 Marines would likely be sufficient to clear Kharg Island of whatever Iranian forces remain after the initial airstrikes. Other analysts suggest the number may need to be higher, depending on how many defenders survived the first wave and how aggressively Tehran moves to reinforce the island before a landing takes place. Either way, with potentially 4,500 Marines available, the U.S. would have significant numbers in reserve. The harder challenge is not taking the island, but holding it. Kharg Island sits just 20 miles from the Iranian coastline, well within range of artillery, rocket systems, and short-range ballistic missiles. Any U.S. garrison on the island would be a permanent, stationary target. Supply convoys bringing food, ammunition, and equipment would have to travel through waters where Iranian drones and fast boats still operate. And while the U.S. has destroyed many of Iran's known missile launch sites, it cannot neutralize the ones it has not yet located until Iran reveals them by firing. There is also the uncomfortable question of what Iran would do to dislodge U.S. forces from the island. Striking American Marines there would risk damaging the oil infrastructure the regime is ostensibly defending. But if that infrastructure is already blockaded and generating no revenue, the argument for restraint largely disappears. The third option stands apart from the other two. Rather than seizing or blockading Kharg Island, the U.S. could simply destroy it, targeting the oil terminals, the pipelines, and all the infrastructure that makes the island economically relevant. According to CNBC, eliminating Kharg Island's export capacity would cost Iran approximately 1.5 million barrels per day in lost crude exports, and rebuilding from such damage would take years. No occupation required, no blockade lines to maintain. A series of targeted strikes and the economic pressure becomes permanent. But the consequences beyond Iran are severe. China purchases approximately 80% of Iran's exported oil, and an abrupt destruction of Kharg Island's infrastructure would hit Beijing hard at a moment when U.S.-China relations are already strained across multiple fronts. Iran would almost certainly retaliate by escalating attacks on the energy infrastructure of its Gulf neighbors, and any future diplomatic resolution in which Iranian oil serves as an inducement to Tehran becomes impossible once the infrastructure no longer exists. For all these reasons, most analysts believe this option is being held in reserve rather than seriously planned as a first move. The diplomatic picture has provided little clarity. On March 20th, Trump ruled out any ceasefire. A day later, he hinted at winding down operations. On March 23rd, reports emerged of preliminary U.S.-Iran talks toward a full resolution of hostilities. Reports that Iran's parliamentary speaker immediately and categorically denied, calling them fabricated and accusing Washington of using them to manipulate oil prices. Trump then announced a 5-day pause on a threatened strike against Iranian power stations, citing the same unconfirmed negotiations. When asked directly in the Oval Office whether he planned to deploy ground troops, he said no, then added that if he were planning such a move, he certainly would not announce it to reporters. It was a perfectly calibrated non-answer. What is not ambiguous is what is physically moving through the world's oceans right now. More than 4,500 U.S. Marines are converging on the Persian Gulf. Reconnaissance drones circle Kharg Island continuously. Attack aircraft are pre-positioned for strikes on coastal defenses. Pentagon planners have their contingency documents ready. And Iran's government, whatever it says in public, knows all of this. It knows that the island handling nearly all of its oil exports now sits within easy reach of the most capable amphibious assault force the United States has assembled in the region in a generation. The oil kept flowing after the first wave of American strikes on Kharg Island. The terminals stood, the pipelines held. Iran's revenues continued, reduced by market uncertainty and the disruption of the broader conflict, but not severed. That was enough to keep the regime alive. But the force now converging on the Persian Gulf suggests that Washington has decided the first round was an opening move, not a conclusion. Whether what comes next takes the form of a blockade, an occupation, or something else entirely, the pressure on Kharg Island is not easing. It is building. And unlike the military infrastructure the U.S. destroyed in March, the oil terminals it deliberately spared the first time around may not survive the second.